You're watching World Insight. We begin our program today with the latest trade dispute between China and the United States. The Chinese Foreign Ministry, as well as Chinese Trade Ministry, on Friday expressed firm opposition to U.S. decision to impose 25% tariffs on $50 billion worth of Chinese goods. The ministry spokesperson says China deeply regrets the U.S. flip-flop, which neglects previous agreements. The spokesperson added that the U.S. move not only hurts the interests of both sides, but also jeopardizes the world trade order. The ministry says that China does not want a trade war, but was forced to take retaliatory measures to defend the interests of the Chinese people and to defend globalization and the multilateral trade system. China's countermeasures will match the U.S. duties, they said. The ministry spokesperson says China urges the international community to join efforts in stopping the slide to a battle of tariffs and defend the international community's common interests. For that, we are also joined in our Beijing studio by Mr. Zhang Junshe, who is a member of the China Committee of the Council of Security Cooperation in East Asia and in the Asia Pacific. Mr. Zhang, welcome to our program. What do you make of the response coming from the Chinese side so far, Mr. Zhang?
Well, I think China strongly supports trade globalism and also the multilateral trade system, and is strongly opposed to unilateral and trade protectionism. China does not want to wage a trade war against the United States, but actually the United States has launched a trade war against China. So we have to take some countermeasures. As a matter of fact, the United States unilateralism and trade protectionism have met with strong opposition from many countries, even from some of its allies, including France, Canada, and Germany. So we hope the United States will think over its measures against other countries and return to a multilateral trade system.
All right, Mr. Zhang Junshe, thank you so much for your comments. We're going to go to you later in other discussions. Thank you, Mr. Zhang. As you may know, regarding the latest round of the trade dispute between China, United States, Chinese Foreign Ministry, as well as China's Commerce Ministry, both responded, as we said earlier. Okay, let's go to another developing story, where Chinese President Xi Jinping in Beijing met U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo on Thursday. President Xi said China and the U.S. should solve their differences and promote bilateral ties. This meeting came just 2 days after a historic summit between the DPRK and the U.S. leaders. Earlier, Chinese side counselor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi also held talks with Pompeo. They exchanged views on denuclearization process of the Korean Peninsula. But before we get down to business, let's take a look at all of this background. Welcome.
It was the first trip to China of America's top diplomat. Chinese President Xi Jinping welcomed U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo in Beijing. President Xi said China and the U.S. should improve understanding, manage differences, and expand cooperation. Pompeo extended greetings from the U.S. President. He said Mr. Trump values his relationship with President Xi, and the U.S. is willing to broaden communication and handle disputes. Earlier, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi met Pompeo separately. He praised the achievements of the summit between DPRK leader Kim Jong-un and Mr. Trump in Singapore earlier this week.
The meeting has put the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula on the right track to talks and peaceful settlement. It has historic significance.
Pompeo thanked China for its efforts.
And so we appreciate all China did to help put us in the place where that summit could happen, and we thank you for that. There's still more work to be done by China and by the United States to get to the ultimate outcome.
At Tuesday's historical summit, the two leaders signed a joint statement on working toward lasting and stable peace on the peninsula and pledging to build new U.S.-DPRK relations. The DPRK agreed on a full and gradual denuclearization, while Trump announced the U.S. is ending war games. The U.S. president also said he was seeking help from China and South Korea. China did help make the summit happen. As a neighbor and regional power, China has played a positive role in promoting peace, hosting the first six-party talks in 2003 and proposing dual suspension in 2017.
So are China and the U.S. on the same page on the Singapore summit after Secretary Pompeo's trip to Beijing? Let's loop in our panelists in Beijing. Once again, we have Mr. Zhang Junshe, who is a member of the China Committee on the Council for Security Cooperation in Asia Pacific. Welcome, sir. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., we have Daryl Kimball, who is the Executive Director of the Arms Control Association. Also joining us in Washington, John Shaws, a senior fellow at the International Securities Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to our discussion. One of the most important things to ask Mr. Kimball is, how much do you think the summit in Singapore has managed to loop the issue of denuclearization into the overall security situation settlement in Northeast Asia?
Well, I think the Singapore summit and the communique are a start. As has been said many times since then, the road is going to be very long to achieve denuclearization, complete denuclearization, and a peace regime on the peninsula. This is a minimal basis for further detailed negotiations. I hope that Secretary Pompeo and his Chinese and the North Korean counterparts will get to work very soon to keep up the momentum. Clearly, the issue of denuclearization and the broader issues of peace and security in the region are interlinked. The statement makes this clear. The question is how the action-for-action steps are going to be sequenced and paced in the negotiations that are yet to come. So there's still many questions and a lot of work to be done.
A lot of work. For those of us who witnessed the earlier 6 rounds of the six-party talks, we all know the enormous amount of work that has to be put into here. And today is only the beginning. But by the way, Mr. Shaws, the Chinese president, when he was meeting with Secretary Pompeo, he's talking about, quote, must be step-by-step fixed. That is the complex issue on the Korean Peninsula. What do you think could be the steps that the U.S. and China can work on, at least the U.S. could agree on and act on?
First, thank you for having me, and good evening.
Great pleasure to have you,
I think the first step is for everyone to take stock of what was the steps and what were the processes that got us to the negotiation in the first place. What led to this meeting? And I think that was a coordinated effort of pressure and intense dialogue between the various parties involved. And if history is a guide, we'll have to keep that up to maintain the kinds of pressure and outcomes that we're seeking ultimately, which have eluded us for more than 60 years. We've seen, at least going this far, an agreement to agree about 12 or 13 times over the past 25 years. And so if we're going to move beyond that, we'll have to see clear, consistent steps by North Korea. We'll have to have steady pressure from the international community to ensure that that happens. And we'll have to find ways to give North Korea the kinds of confidence it needs to proceed without sacrificing overall peace and security on the Korean Peninsula.
Very interesting. Mr. Shaws, then can you elaborate on what kind of things that the U.S. could provide in order to give the DPRK some kind of confidence to proceed with what they have agreed to, so-called step-by-step or action-by-action in a way? What could be the action that the U.S. could take despite of the lip service already quite intense over the past few weeks?
Well, I think thinking through what those actions are might be premature, as North Korea has a number of obligations it's not yet living up to under UN Security Council resolution sanctions and previous commitments it's made to both China, South Korea, and the United States. And I think before we really engage in that conversation, we need to see North Korea really make substantive progress on previous commitments.
All right. The North Koreans claim, Mr. Zhang, here in Beijing, that they have destroyed the missile test center they have also destroyed some of the earlier test sites, as the international community media at least witnessed. Of course, the media did not witness the destroy of it, but rather the final product, apparently, of it. And then they also see the DPRK side going to meet with the U.S. side, with the efforts made by both sides. And they have a document. So do you think the DPRK side, to your understanding, has made some efforts to take actions?
Yes, sure. We have seen that the North Korea side has dismantled its nuclear test sites in northeast North Korea, and also it has dismantled its missile test sites. So I think this is the first step, very positive, toward denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. But we know that step by step and action for action. So now I think it's the United States to take some active measures toward this.
All right. Mr. Kimball, I'm sure Mr. Zhang here in China is not representing the DPRK to say anything, but rather as an observer from the region who's involved earlier in various rounds of talks, I mean China, for example, talking about that. So, Mr. Kimball, we also witnessed the United States has certain kinds of credibility issue as well, as an observer from outside, for example. Some of the earlier rounds of six-party talks, if history could be a reference, U.S. did not necessarily implement on time the promises it made to DPRK, for example. And therefore, both sides could have enough ammunition to blame one another. And that's why the talks fall eventually to nowhere. So now we have another momentum, a very starting point. Will we have an early death already at this starting point? Or are we going to see at least a few more steps being taken by both sides to tango a little bit for a healthier process?
Well, I hope so. You know, the past history shows that the two sides did reach important agreements, very much like the one we just saw in Singapore. There was progress in the initial phases. I mean, of course, the agreed framework of 1994 froze North Korea's plutonium program for 8 years. That is a success. But these past agreements fell apart when both sides failed to follow up on the implementation steps in the later phases. So. First of all, we have to talk about what each side needs to do. And let me just go back to your earlier question. The North Koreans have not shut down their test site. They have taken some confidence-building steps. They have halted ballistic missile testing. They continue to produce fissile material. So the first thing I think the United States is going to be demanding that the North Koreans do is to solidify the halt of ballistic missile and nuclear testing, to stop the production of highly enriched uranium and plutonium, and to provide a declaration of North Korea's nuclear weapons holdings and its facilities so that inspectors can verify the accuracy and completeness of that so that it can be dismantled later. At the same time, the United States does need to take additional steps. President Trump suspended the exercises. I think that was a useful confidence-building step, but that could be reversed again. So the thing that the United States, along with China, need to be discussing in parallel with denuclearization is how to formally negotiate a peace treaty that formally ends the Korean War, and how the United States will, over the long term, modify the military exercises to address North Korea's concerns about strategic assets being in the region that could be used for a preventive strike. So those are some of the things that I think should be and will be on the table. But as I said before, the question is the pacing and the sequence. And I think it would be a mistake for one side to say the other should take the first step and the other to demand the other take the first step. That is a recipe for disaster. These steps need to happen in parallel.
Mr. Kimball, with your rich experience about the issue, your opinions are very respectable. However, I have to say, Mr. Scholz, if you look at the two issues, one is for the North Koreans to come up with a list about their nuclear capabilities and about their sites so that the international community can come in and visit and inspect. Vis-a-vis the signing of a peace treaty, which could involve quite a number of countries, at least, and then also international organizations and also international arrangements. So this, the second one, could always take much longer than the very first one. That, in a way, could make the DPRK think, if I provide the list much earlier, well, you guys are still trying to work out so-called peace treaty, which we do not know when there's going to be a result. How could we see the action by action, step by step? So there is a time difference, not only about the things that people need to do on both sides, but also the time difference between these steps. These are very practical and could be used in negotiations and also walking away from the real commitments. Mr. Scholz.
Oh, I think that's exactly right. The time difference between making a declaration of one's nuclear program and then having that investigated and reviewed and inspected and then ultimately validated that that program has been terminated and relinquished, that's a very long process. We've seen that in a number of countries, and we've started down that path previously with North Korea to some success, but ultimately limited success. I think thinking about, to me, thinking about a peace treaty before we've even begun the process of reviewing North Korea's declaration and seeing how much good faith it is engaging in and with is premature. Ultimately, the Korean War was started in 1950, and the United States and other countries are there because of a UN Security Council resolution. So to say that this is, as you pointed out, a bilateral issue is not an appropriate way to frame it, I think, because the Korean Peninsula problem has always been an international and multinational challenge.
Yes, it is an international and multilateral challenge, but what we are talking about is how can we make sure both sides, particularly DPRK and the United States, think they are not being taken advantage of the other side, that because of the actions taken by both sides that could take a different stretch of time. And therefore, how should we make that timetable to make everybody satisfied and feel not being cheated and therefore could move on with their part of the actions? That's the real challenge. Having said that, though, there's another issue, Mr. Zhang. If you look at the whole thing, that is, to what extent this is really a bilateral issue, but also to what extent should it go multilateral? Remember the six-party talks, the reason it is multilateral is because the United States did not want to face-to-face directly with the DPRK alone, but rather want the guarantees from all the other parties. Meanwhile, the other parties have their concerns in the issue as well. So, Mr. Zhang, here comes the question. To what extent does the U.S. and the DPRK really have to commit on their own about real actions and make it happen? To what extent can they fall back onto a multilateral framework with which they could use as guarantee, but at the same time use as encouragement for them to act? Mr. Zhang.
Well, I think first we have to say that both sides, North Korea and the United States, have made some positive gestures or moves toward denuclearization. First, we just talk about North Korea's moves, and also from the U.S. side, we have seen that President Trump has said that it will give North Korea a security guarantee if it pursues denuclearization. And also, he suggested that the United States and South Korea will suspend their military exercises. I think these are all the good momentum on this way. And later, of course, both sides should make more efforts toward denuclearization. China has proposed the dual-track approach. One side, North Korea should realize denuclearization, but the other, at the same time, the United States should also give the security guarantee. So what type of security guarantee will the United States give?
Right.
Is a treaty endorsed by the U.S. Congress and signed by the U.S. President, or with other countries. We know the armistice treaty was signed by not only North Korea and the United States, but also China. So I think in the coming days, when it is necessary, I think the two sides may invite China and other parties, including South Korea, to join in the progress. I think China is ready to provide advice and also support.
We are,
yes.
We are, Mr. Zhang, as you said, in a new time, a new territory, because earlier, the earlier 6 rounds of 6-party talks, the DPRK did not develop the nuclear capabilities yet, not to the extent that they have, and the ICBM that they are having today. Meanwhile, we have never seen the DPRK and the US side would be able to sit down face to face. First time, 70 years, ever happened. This could be a very good start. However, the history could be of some reference, as we say. That's why earlier I spoke to US Ambassador Christopher Hill, who led the US delegation at the 6-party talks between the year 2005 and 2007. Mr. Hill speaks highly of China's key role, of course, in fixing concerns for all interested parties in the 6-party talks, and he talked about the solutions. Let's listen in.
It was a responsibility to try to bring in all these different perspectives. And I think China did it very well, and I think all the people, Chinese, who watched this should have been very proud to see what the Chinese delegation did.
All right, that was Christopher Hill, the head of the U.S. delegation for the last 3 rounds of the 6-party talks earlier. Having said that, though, China's role, has that changed, Mr. Kimball?
Well, I think China still plays a crucial role. China can speak to all of the interested parties, all the concerned parties here. The problem we have now is essentially a 6-party negotiation without the 6 parties sitting around the same table. So that's why you see, Secretary Pompeo going from Singapore to Seoul, where he met with the South Korean foreign minister, the Japanese foreign minister, and now on to Beijing. So the work, the diplomacy is going to be more difficult because it's going to have to be done in this kind of shuttle diplomacy fashion. But I think China still plays a linchpin role. China's participation and support for ongoing sanctions enforcement is crucial. China's advice to the United States about what will motivate and induce and cajole North Korea to do the right things is very important and useful. And having China's support with the United States and Russia on the UN Security Council to endorse any future agreement and its enforcement is also crucial. So China needs to be a part of the negotiation, but I think the negotiations will effectively be going on between the United States and North Korea.
Mr. Scholz, though, there's another issue if we talk about China's role. The United States and China, particularly in recent months, have a lot of things going on between them. Therefore, the trust based on which to work on DPRK issue, on the rather Korean Peninsula nuclear issue, and some of the other issues become more challenging even than they used to be, let's just say, during the earlier rounds of the 6-party talks, because of the relations between China and the United States. Mr. Scholz, is there any way out?
Is there any way out for the United States and China?
Yes.
I don't remember if it was President Xi or the foreign minister who today said that or yesterday, that it's normal for countries to compete with one another. And Secretary Pompeo offered that where China and the United States can cooperate, a great deal can be achieved. And I think we're seeing those 2 different thrusts of the relationship play out in real time, today and yesterday, where China and the United States largely agree on the objectives for denuclearizing North Korea. And on the trade issue, there's some pretty stiff opposition on either side. And I think that discussion will take some time to play out as well. So I think in the areas where there are common interests, continuing to work together will be important, but insulating those issues from the more contentious areas will be complicated. The United States and China do have some experience with that kind of insulation and finding ways to compartmentalize problematic conversations or difficult conversations while pursuing positive-sum conversations. And I think we have an opportunity to continue that pattern with the DPRK negotiation.
We hope that will be the case. However, I want to correct, it is not DPRK denuclearization, it's rather Korean Peninsula denuclearization. Denuclearization, that is a phrase being used in the joint statement between the DPRK and the United States. Those are two very different concepts. Before we go, Mr. Zhang, I want to ask your opinion as well. Can China-U.S. work together on this? Can China-U.S. together with other multilateral partners to work on this?
Yes, sure. I think China and the United States can cooperate more closely on the Korean Peninsula issue and also on other regional and international issues such as anti-terrorism, and also we have seen a good cooperation between the Chinese military and the U.S. military in fighting piracy in the Gulf of Aden and waters of Somalia. We are fighting against non-traditional security threats. Yes.
So there is a way, you think, if there is a will?
Yes.
All right. For the three of you, gentlemen, thank you so much. Zhang Junshe, Daryl Kimball, and John Schross. Really appreciate, gentlemen, for being with us and sharing your insights. Thank you so much.